all of this, I think, would have been fine. It could have gone on for millions of years in this climaxed situation. The orgies were lunar, meaning they probably occurred every 2 weeks or at most every 28 days. That means every 28 days, every member of this society was completely dissolving any psychic structures that may have arisen in the previous 28 days, and then everybody was just jumping on each other's bones in a big heap. And you can imagine the boundary dissolving impact that something like that would have. Why then, if it was so wonderful, didn't we just stick with it? Why the descent into, you know, the hell of Pee Wee Herman and Richard Nixon and all of this stuff? Well, the same culprit that created that happy story destroyed that happy scenario, and that is the continued drying up of the planet. And that's what we get in that Genesis story. Remember at the end of the Genesis story it says, and God set an angel at the eastern gate of Eden with a flaming sword so that Adam and his children could not find their way back into paradise. That's a memory of the Saharan sun scorching off the African veldt and forcing those mushroom-using pastoralists to settle in the Nile Valley and set up permanent settlements and begin thinking about kingship, large-scale agricultural projects, and so forth and so on. And what happened, it was not as simple as that may have made it seem, you see. This is really the theme of this book that I wrote for Bantam, is the theme that cultures wear drugs like clothing, and they're never aware of it. They just feel naked without their particular drug. And the clothing may differ. You know, one culture feels fully dressed in penis sheaths and war paint. Another culture isn't fully dressed unless the gown is by Dior. So there are different styles of clothing, and there are different styles of mental clothing in the form of drugs, and these drugs promote different kinds of cultural values. And what happened in this African situation was a tragedy that in a way we have seen enacted in microcosm in our own society. It was that at a certain point everything was perfect. The monthly orgies, the suppression of ego, the group values, the recent invention of language was making food gathering easy for women. The abundant game was making hunting easy for men, so forth and so on. But this drying of the African continent didn't halt there. It continued, and pretty soon there were problems. Less game, less to be gathered, and most important for my theory, fewer mushrooms. And when there became fewer mushrooms, then there were two possibilities. You could have your mushroom orgies less frequently, or you could create some kind of technology for preserving the mushrooms so that when you found a lot of them, you could save some of them for dry spells, literally for dry spells. Now, the problem with this strategy is that in a world without refrigeration, the strategy which Aboriginal people in Australia, in the Amazon basin, the strategy which Aboriginal people tend toward when they want to preserve some delicate food is they invariably go for honey. Honey. This is why some of you may know that the Romans ate hummingbirds' tongues pickled in honey. It isn't because honey was the preferred medium for pickling hummingbirds' tongues. It was because that's a way of preserving delicate food. The problem with honey is honey itself can ferment into a psychoactive compound. Honey changes into mead. Mead is a form of crude alcohol. The impact on a goddess-worshipping, orgiastic, non-hierarchical, non-male dominant culture of switching over to the use of alcohol is absolutely devastating. In the same way that I told you what psilocybin did, improves visual acuity, promotes sexual activity, delivers a religious experience, we can talk about what alcohol does. It lowers sensitivity to social cueing at the same time that it gives an empowered sense of ego. In other words, it makes you into a jerk. It gives you the courage to say and do what, if you are a decent person, you would otherwise never say and never do. It turns each one of us into a Clarence Thomas. This is not what's needed. Boo, yes, no, who knows? Who is Clarence Thomas anyway? And time again in human history, these kinds of synergies have been enacted. Well, I want to say more about it. That isn't the whole story. That could be the whole story. I mean, there's enough in that for it to be the whole story. In other words, if it's true that the mushroom suppresses male dominance, if it in fact promotes communal values and so forth, then what a wonderful thing it must be, and we can leave it there. But that's only a small part of the story. The real story is what is so wonderful about it. Since it's a mental experience, what is so wonderful about it that it could halt the human tendency to devolve into these counterproductive forms and lifestyles? Well, what is so great about it is that it is nothing less than half of the intellectual universe. It is what I call the connection to the Gaian mind. In other words, to this point, what I've said could be imputed to be just talk about a superb psychedelic drug. And so they're saying, oh, well, so this guy advocates the use of a superb psychedelic drug. It seems reasonable or unreasonable, depending on where you went to church. But it's not that paradigm challenging. But what is paradigm challenging is the content of the experience. The content of the experience is completely mind-boggling, completely befuddling. I don't know what we're going to do with the content of the experience, because fully gotten out and fully discussed and fully realized, it's not going to leave one brick upon another in the cheerfully naive edifice that our half-baked civilization has erected as universal truth. We're not going to, science is not going to be able to survive the encounter with the psychedelic experience, because it is not an encounter with the Freudian, the repressed memories of your miserable and battered childhood or whatever it is you went through, and it isn't even an encounter with the miserable memories of the battered childhood of the human species that we all went through, a la Carl Jung. That is all there. But that's in the hallway where you hang your hat and the antechamber where they take your coat. The main event, folks, doesn't even have anything to do with the psychology of human beings. The main event is another dimension. A dimension so bizarre, so titanically peculiar, so strange, so unanticipated by our language, our history, our literature, that it is literally like the discovery of another world. And there's life in that world. Now, a funny thing about discovering new worlds is that you usually, when you get the new world all mapped out, you usually discover that there's somebody living there. And for them, it's not the new world at all. And, you know, you haven't discovered anything. You've just shown up in the middle of their scene with a distorted rap, sort of like Christopher Columbus. And this is what we find with the psychedelics. And this is why shamanism becomes, to my mind, the bridge to understanding what this archaic revival is all about. The shamanic hallucinogens are the meat of the thing, the pith essence, the center of the mandala. But the bridge into that is the effects that these things have, the content, the experiences that we can language and tell each other about. And what we are discovering through shamanism, through looking at it not through the condescending eyes of the white man who is just impressed by the incredibly droll quaintness of whatever these brown-skinned people have dreamed up, not that, but through a realization that we are sick and no doctor can cure us, because we're not that kind of sick. It's soul sickness. I mean, it has to be soul sickness. When you see stuff like Chernobyl, or the Kuwaiti oil fields, or the Hanford nuclear reservation in Washington, when you realize what this really means, then you realize, you know, this is a mad species. This is a terminally depraved species. And what is required is a return to a model that can heal. And this is what shamanism has always been about. And we have not recognized it because the part of the human being which shamanism addresses, which is the soul and the spirit, we have a 500-year-old tradition that denies that there are such things. So for us, it's absurd. Shamanism. It is, you know, painted rattles, guys dancing around in the middle of the night, blowing perfumed water around and smoking too much tobacco. That's shamanism for us, because we cannot see with the eyes that understand. When we do, what we realize is that half of our mind has been taken away from us. That, yes, the human body protrudes into profane space as 120 to 350 pounds of meat somewhere in the universe. But that isn't the domain of humanness. The true domain of humanness is inclusive of that and much, much more, because the true domain of humanness is a domain that honors the mind as self and as landscape. I mean, you are a creature loose in a landscape of meaning, and you are that landscape of meaning. And by losing contact with this, we have become essentially pathological, very needy. This is a typical pattern in a person with an abused childhood. They become very, very needy, very thing-oriented, very security conscious, very anxious. This is a picture of us and our psychology. And we are so deep into the historical nightmare that we can't ever remember any other way of doing business. I mean, we know we're messed up. We know we're unhappy. But what's to be done, you know? I mean, we have a million minor fixes and people peddling all of these things. I mean, you've just been through the aisles. You know what I'm talking about. But somehow salvation itself becomes an impediment to salvation. I mean, once you see 500 forms of salvation being sold at prices you can't afford, the very notion of salvation becomes obscene. You know, it becomes one more layer in the obscene layering that takes meaning out of life and disempowers us and turns us into a subscription customer. That seems to be how we always are being forced to end up. Well, the only way out of this, I think, is to, it takes courage, because you have to turn your back on your culture in the most profound sense there is, because there are many ways to turn your back on your culture. I mean, if everyone's wearing gray, you can wear green. That's one way to turn your back on a culture. But another way is to break its laws. Now, that's a little more serious and, you know, brings in big philosophical issues. But in fact, the culture is an enormous arrow pointing, go this way. And you know what lies that way? Impoverishment, madness, degradation, and death. That's where the culture is pointing. You can see it. You can see it. Just look where we're headed. If everyone on earth aspires to the kind of lifestyle that you people can enjoy by virtue of having paid the money to be at a scene like this, there isn't enough glass, metal, and plastic in the planet to make that many Celicas and jaguars and bluebirds and snowbirds and all the rest of this crap. So what is needed is an awakening. Now, I mentioned earlier in this talk that in the 50s, before they interfered with LSD research, they were curing chronic alcoholism with a single 500 gamma dose of LSD. Well, now, for heaven's sake, nobody is suggesting that LSD is a cure for alcoholism. That, to me, is absurd. It's not a cure for alcoholism. It's a cure for stupidity. And a person who is killing themselves by drinking themselves to death takes 500 mics of LSD and says, what a stupid person I am. I'm killing myself. And so then they look at their behavior and they cease that behavior. And this is what has to be done on a societal scale. And it is not as difficult as we may wish to be assured by the establishment. The whole falderall and hoop-de-doo about the 1960s was that the crypto-fascist bullshit agenda was damn near overthrown by a bunch of 19 and 20-year-olds on campuses scattered around the high-tech world. The male-dominant agenda is so fragile that any competitor is felt as a deadly foe. And the fact that these ideas will not die, in spite of the fact that, you know, they've raised the price of an ounce of weed from $15 to $500. They've made the pinch for growing weed from a slap on the wrist to lose everything you ever owned or dreamed of owning. And they cannot push it into extinction. It's because it's so much older than their con game. They've invented their con game post-Sphinx or something, and we're talking about a reality that reaches back 15, 25, 30,000 years. And it's a reality, so far, I've only spoken, I keep trying to get to this subject, but I won't let myself for some reason. So far, I've spoken of it as boundary dissolving, promoting group sexual activity, this and that and the other thing. But those are like generalizations. What is really interesting about the psychedelic experience is it shows you a mental universe that you not only never suspected existed, but that you could not have suspected existed. I don't think there's another way to it. I mean, I'm not ready to categorically say there's no other way to it, and occasionally, especially at gatherings like this, people grab me and assure me there are other ways to it. And they say, you know, if you just, I want you to meet Babaji. He's as good as psilocybin. And, oh, really? I want to meet this man. because I mean, let me say a little bit more about this. I would like to believe that in principle you could get to these places on the natch. Only in principle, however, because if some people say, well, you know, these things you describe on DMT and psilocybin, I can show you how to do that naturally. No, thank you. Are you kidding? Thank God I have the drug as a kind of marker so that I know when I'm getting close to that stuff. If I woke up one morning in that place and I couldn't tell myself I'd taken mushrooms, I would define myself as seriously discombobulated and wait to see what happens, you know? And people say, well, don't you think you ought to be able to do it by yourself? And I love this question because the answer is you can't do it by yourself. That's the entire message of the last 10,000 years of human history. The self is insufficient. The ego will not suffice. The only way you're ever going to get anywhere is you must humble yourself to the point where you admit that you can't do it unless you have help from someone whose idea of home is a cow flop. If you're willing to humble yourself to that degree, then maybe we can get somewhere. The content of the psychedelic experience is, I believe, relating to that is the sum total of our humanness. And I think, based on experience, that there is a certain amount of leakage from the future backward into the past, and that many of the phenomena that are being interpreted as past lives and reincarnation and channeling and regression this and clairvoyant that, all this has to do with a misunderstanding about how causality actually works. That all of the impressions upon which people are building these models, channeling and spirit guides and reincarnation and so forth, the material upon which these models are being built is real, but the models that are being built are tremendous compressions of the reality of the situation. I mean, when someone tells me that they experienced a past life regression and that they were a butcher in 13th century Florence, I always think to myself, but you were a butcher in 13th century everywhere. and you were a butcher in 14th century everywhere. I mean, once the connection is opened, the connection is not particular. The connection is general. It is all reality is who you are. All reality is where you are and where you've been and where you will be. And two things are operating in the hidden dimension of the human mind. One of them is what I call the Gaian mind. And this is being imaged in this society as the rebirth of a kind of goddess. People are realizing on different levels and at different levels of sophistication that the energy of being can be imaged as a female entelechy, an enclosing, nurturing, caring, forgiving kind of entelechy. And this is what psychedelic shamanism has always been about. It's about a connection to the Gaian mind. And this gives you, obviously, a tremendous sense of being embedded in a larger coherency than merely the coherency of your own small life. And that's very empowering. But it's not the general sense of things that this Gaian mind imparts that is really, to me, the interesting part. It's that the Gaian mind is a real mind. It has information. It can tell you things of the most specific and personally important sort. It tells you where the game has gone. It tells you who poisoned the well. It tells you who raped so-and-so. It tells you why person X is ill and unable to get well. In other words, the Gaian mind is the database that all shamans seek to connect to in the act of curing, in the act of functioning as doctors for their society. They get a connection to the Gaian mind. And again, at this point, I feel like I have to remind you, I come to this as a skeptic, as a sneerer. I mean, I have no time for this stuff unless it's real. It happens to be real. You have to take psilocybin, as far as I can tell, to encounter it, at least if you have the kind of lump and neurophysiology that I have. I mean, I've never been with the etheric crowd, you know. But this Gaian empowerment is what allowed these societies to live without technology, without modern medicine, without remote sensing devices, without any of the appurtenances of technology that we take for granted. And we have lost this connection. We can't even imagine it. If someone were to begin talking about how the earth was speaking to them and giving them messages about how to live, you instinctively can sense this is something to be very, very careful with. You give that rap to the wrong person and they'll drop a net over you and you'll find yourself stuffing envelopes for a convalescent home or something. Okay, so that's part of it, the Gaian mind. And it is this feminine, nurturing, enfolding thing. It's the mind of nature itself. It is really our own mind, but extending then away from this possessive notion of our mind back into the general concept of mind itself. And then the other pole, or the other motif encountered in this situation, is trickier to envision. I call it the transcendental object at the end of time. This, if we were, fanatically symmetrical model makers, then we would assign a kind of masculine value to this. But I'm not particularly into that. I just see it as the transcendental object at the end of time. But what it is it's a kind of attractor. And we're not accustomed to thinking of the historical situation as being under the influence of an attractor. We inherit our belief that history is being pushed rather than pulled. We inherit this idea from the 19th century when the theory of evolution was elaborated. These 19th century British atheists who were creating the theory of evolution were so horrified by the power of deism, meaning the belief in God per se, that they constructed a theory of evolution where everything is pushed from behind. In Darwinian evolution, there is no purpose. A good Darwinist never lets the word purpose cross his lips. A good Darwinist knows that things just happen randomly, and then natural selection makes its selection, and then you get whatever you get. And this is understandable in the intellectual atmosphere of the 19th century, that they would want to get away from that. The problem is we have matured now beyond the simple atheism of the 19th century, and it is now very reasonable, sanctioned by mathematics and dynamics and so forth and so on. It is now very reasonable to speak of an attractor. And this is, I'm also a little nervous to talk about this because part of what I do is I popularize. I tell you things which you should know yourself, or which you could know yourself if you would but go to a decent medical library and spend the time to look up all this botanical and pharmacological data. So I'm like a clearinghouse. But then there's another thing which I do, which I'm a little more nervous and touchy about, which is I tell you what I think. And it's just what I think. It has exactly that much weight behind it, which is like zip. I mean, you don't have to believe this. Why should you? But based on 25 years of fiddling with this stuff and then doing a lot of reading and head scratching, I've come to the conclusion that there is a transcendental object ahead of us in time. You can call it God, you can call it Jesus, you can call it her, you can call it flying saucers from Zeta Reticuli, or the Pleiades. I want to get all factions here. Or Zenebel-Ganubi, my favorite stellar origin point. But whatever you call it, it's an attractor. It lies ahead of us in the future, and all of human history is being channeled toward it, pulled toward it. And I see the entire history of the universe as the history of a journey across a landscape of energy and matter toward union with this transcendental object. And I have a theory of history, not the mathematical one. Don't bolt for the door. No, this will be a cocktail party version of the theory of history. I have a theory of history, which is the universe is a novelty producing and conserving engine of some sort. That's what we're inside, folks. A novelty-making machine. Now, what do I mean by novelty? People say, you mean like little plastic bugs and puzzles inside plastic capsules? Is that what you mean by novelty? No, you idiot. Of course not. by novelty, I mean something that has never been seen before, something unique, the new connection. I always think of the symbolist poet Lautréamont, who said, I am fascinated by the kind of beauty that arises when a bicycle meets a sewing machine on an operating table. Now that's novelty, folks, because you just don't get that every day. So the universe is a novelty-producing engine. It not only produces novelty, but it then preserves it and builds upon it. So if we now look at the story which science tells us, and it's an interesting story, by the way. If you think I say things which are highly unlikely, notice that I do not ask you to believe that the universe sprang from a point of matter smaller than a proton in a single instant. This is the position of science. This is the limit case for credibility. I mean, if you can believe that, what in the world would you balk at, for crying out loud? I mean, that is the limit case for credibility. So, science tells us that the universe sprang from nothing in a single instant and that it was very hot. Very hot. So there were no molecules such as you and I are made out of. There were no atoms such as lead and gold and water are made out of. There was only a pure plasma of electrons. That was all. And the physics of that universe were incredibly simple. There were the pure plasma physics, unhindered by any other fields of any sort. Well, the universe then cooled. And as it cooled, lo and behold, at a certain point, electrons were able to fall into stable orbits around atomic nuclei. And at that point, atomic systems formed. And a whole new kind of chemistry comes into being. Further cooling, millions of years pass. Then we get the carbon molecule cooked out of new stars. It has a 6-valent structure so that we get organic molecules. Well, then, quickly, we get long-chain polymers. Very quickly, then, long-chain polymers that can copy themselves. And then and that becomes primitive life. And at that point, you then get complex life. And then sexuality, meaning gene mixing, as opposed to the previous thing, which was vegetative, like making cuttings from plants. Well, do you see what's happening? At each successive stage, the previous level of complexity is not only retained, but used to build upon toward the next level of complexity. Well, the wonderful thing about this cosmology is that instead of human beings being like mute witnesses to the grandeur of Jehovah's creation or some kind of trip like that, instead you discover, human beings are important. We are more novel than anything else in nature. And we 20th century human beings are more novel, more interconnected, more complex, and in possession of more and different kinds of knowledge than most of the people who preceded us. So this growing toward complexity seems to be what the universe is all about. Now, it doesn't go on for hundreds of millions of years into the future, because as you can see, each successive stage has proceeded more quickly than the stage before it. So now we are in what I call the short epochs. We are in periods of time where more change goes on in a 10-year period than went on in a million-year period near the birth of the universe. We are living in the complex novel end of things. And that complexity and that novelty, which we experience as tremendous stress in our lives, ushers into the transcendental object at the end of time, not that far in the future. And we, as psychedelic people, have an obligation upon ourselves to anticipate and to help realize this future. It is upon us. Every messiah, every religious ontology, every manager of every booth at this exhibit is reflecting a distorted scintilla of the spiritual reality of the transcendental object at the end of time. Every one of us is a particularized and distorted image of this transcendental object into which we are being dissolved, into which global culture is being dissolved. So, well, so what? So we can cut into this cycle at any point. We can become aware of it. We can become part of it. We can deny it. There is no loss in the circuit. There is no blame. Becoming, then, what psychedelic means is it means claiming this dimension as your own. You know, Plato said time is the moving image of eternity. That moving image of eternity can be beheld in the silent darkness of the mind on 5 grams of psilocybin. And if you think the universe is mundane, if you think there are no more frontiers to cross, no more adventures to be had, I'm telling you, you can turn your living room into the bridge of Magellan's ship on a long Saturday evening with 5 grams of psilocybin in silent darkness. We are living in the most empowering age in human history because all of the energy of the ancestors, not only the human ancestors, but our animal, our primate ancestors, all of that energy pours into, is focused into this moment. We are the transition generation. We have 1 foot in matter and 1 foot in hyperspace. And we can redeem the trust of thousands of years. All of the horror of history can be redeemed if we don't drop the ball. Every pogrom, every instance of racial, sexual, or minority persecution can be redeemed if we give the human adventure meaning. And we give it meaning by discovering the totality within ourselves and then exemplifying it for each other. And this dissolves boundaries, empowers the weak, enlightens the strong, and brings hope to all. And it can only be done if we accept the gifts which nature has offered us. Thank you very, very much.